Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Emma, and I've got Ben with me, and we're going to be talking about the importance of communication as a part of my favorite topic, change management. But before we get to all the questions that I've got for you, Ben, can you give everybody an introduction?
Sure. Emma, thanks for having me on the show. I'm always excited to be here. I've been in the communications game for almost 30 years. One thing I've realized is that the Bernard Shaw thing is the one misconception about communication is it actually happens. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but that's really what the quote is. It's our thought process that just because we've said something, that it's been understood, that it's been valued, that it's been internalized, it's been recalled. And that's really what I'm all about. I have been everywhere from direct mail to promotional marketing to brand development and everything over the last 27 years. And what I've realized is that we do a really good job marketing and communicating our brand, or at least we try to, outside the company. We do a horrific job doing it inside. So that's where I've spent the last 10 years, helping companies drive communication, drive change within their companies, and be more effective at getting people to understand why they're doing what they do.
Great. So I want to start with probably a real softball of a question for you based off of that experience and even just the quote that you just shared. But from your perspective, why is communication and a true strategy around your communication so important when you've got an internal change happen?
I truly believe change doesn't happen unless we have communication. I mean, I think the latest statistics are that 70% of change management initiatives fail. And a lot of it doesn't come down to process and procedure. It comes down to people not understanding why we're changing in the first place. People are terrified of change. They truly are. They're terrified of change. They don't understand why they're changing. They don't understand how it affects them. They don't understand if it means their job is being eliminated. And they don't understand what they're going to benefit if and when the change happens, and truly what the ramifications of not changing are. So the more we can communicate through the process, what's going to happen, what is happening, what's going to happen, why, how we need you to do what in order to achieve this, the better off we are. Because if we don't do all of that, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Miscommunication happens, millions of dollars are misspent, and initiatives fail.
So I saw a statistic the other day that was like the average employee needs to hear something 7 times, not just to remember it, but to realize the importance that it has within an organization. And I think that's again, kind of coming back to everything that you've said so far, this idea that there really isn't a way to over communicate. If somebody's heard it and they heard the message and they don't need it again, they'll start to tune you out. But the other 10 people that still need that message are going to continue to engage with it and then recognize the importance of what you're trying to share. So I guess where I want to take things now is talking through a little bit of tactics or approaches that you've seen be really valuable for sharing that 7 times that people need to hear a message.
Exactly. And the first thing we need to understand is different people learn differently. I mean, I want to get back to your 7 times. Think of a billboard. How many times have you driven past a billboard, not noticed it, and only by the time you've reached it 7 or 8 or 10 or 15 times did you sit there going, oh, it was for McDonald's. Oh, there's a new McDonald's at the next exit. Wait a second, they're offering free coffee if I stop by. We get so busy with our lives, we get so stuck in our own minutia that we lose the bigger picture and we don't pay attention to what is immediately important to us. So different people need to be communicated differently. Some people are oral communicators, some people are visual communicators, some people want to read a memo, some people want to listen to a podcast. So there's lots of different tactics that you use, and the more you can combine them, the better off it is. We use, for large to enterprise level companies, we use an internal podcast. And the reason we do that is not only because it is an oral communication that gets you information right from the person who actually is doing the thing, and we can get voices from across the organization, but that podcast then can be turned into white papers, articles, posts, short videos, short audio clips. There's all sorts of things that we can do with that podcast in order to turn it into different mediums so it can be shared across your Slack, your Teams, your team meetings, everywhere, in order to be able to let different people engage with that information differently. and still get the message.
So I want to dive into this before we round out our conversation, specifically that idea of use of podcasts internally, because we're all very familiar with consuming information, and kind of back to your introduction, we do a great job of sharing who we are and what we do externally, but maybe not internally. So can you talk a little bit about how your customers, beyond just creating this content and using it to share and communicate about change, what have you seen done with internal podcasts that you think is important for people to recognize?
Well, the first thing I realized is that internal podcasts need to be private and secure. They need to be for internal eyes only, and everybody needs to know that they're for internal eyes only, and use technology that makes sure that the things cannot be shared outside the organization. That way you can share sensitive information. That way you can actually get people who need to know the information, knowing that that information is going to stay in-house, and be able to have those frank, honest, and open conversations that you may not want to have happen and let your competitors know about. So that's the first thing you need to think about. The second thing you need to realize is, okay, what is our objectives? What are the goals we're trying to reach? Is it a piece of change? Say it's a change initiative. We had an organization where they bought a company that was 8,000 employees. And the problem is, to traditionally bring those people on board and do an onboarding process was going to cost $35 or $40 million. The trick is to have an internal podcast that on a weekly basis provides cultural information from different points of view, from different voices. So they heard from the CFO, they heard from HR, they heard from the CEO, they heard from different department heads, they heard from people who are going through the change, and found out what the old company did, what the new company did, where the differences were, where the similarities were, what the new goals were, what the new objectives were, what were the challenges along the way. And not only is it listening to the information and you have a repository of the information to go back to, but it also stimulated conversations on the Slack or Teams channel, and also in the live meetings within the organization. So when you can stimulate the conversations, when you can create opportunities for that information to go beyond the podcast and become thoughts of and initiatives, the better off the internal podcasts become.
It's almost like an asynchronous meeting of sorts, where you're able to kick off those conversations. And I know, kind of going back to that idea of different styles, Amazon made a lot of noise for their policy where you have a giant memo that you read and then you come into the meeting only after having read that, which for some people might work. But I'm going back to your idea of auditory learners. I learn and retain through conversation. So something like a podcast might be a much better mechanism for me to digest that information heading into a meeting, if we're going to have to take that kind of asynchronous approach to communication. So I think that that's a really valuable tool for people to recognize they can in their toolkit.
Yeah, and it's really simple. So take that meeting, for example. The leader of that meeting can have a 5-minute video conversation with themselves online. They can share it with everybody, and that same memo can be transcribed into a document as well. So certain people are going to listen to it auditory. Certain people are going to want to have the document with them. There are people out there that like to have the written thing. They want to have something that they can highlight, that they can take notes on, something that they can refer back to and say, hey, wait a second here, this is exactly what you said. And different people learn differently. Different people respond to information differently. Different people react to different information differently. So the more opportunities we can give people to learn in the medium that they are comfortable with, the better off we are. And technology is at a point where we can take that long form podcast and turn that into different pieces of content easily and effectively, and it allows us to have that ability.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for the conversation, Ben. And for anybody that's not, make sure you connect with him on LinkedIn, and reach out to either one of us with any questions that you might have about the discussion. But thank you so much for your time, Ben. And thank you everybody for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Leading Change. If you liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe and come back weekly for more expert interviews on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.